Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Cathy Hannabach. This is episode 93, and my guest today is Amber Jamilla Musser. Amber has published widely on race, critical theory, queer femininities, sexuality, and queer of color critique. She's the author of 2 books examining racialized sexuality and aesthetics, Sensual Excess, Queer Femininity, and Brown Jouissance, which was published in 2018 by NYU Press, as well as Sensational Flesh, Race, Power, and Masochism, which was published in 2014, also by NYU Press. Amber teaches American Studies at George Washington University and writes art criticism with Maureen Katabagan for the Brooklyn Rail. She's held fellowships at New York University's Draper Program in Gender Studies, as well as Brown University's Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women. Her research has been supported by grants from the Ruth Landys Memorial Fellowship, as well as the Art Writers Grant from the Warhol Foundation. In our interview, Amber and I discuss how abstraction and materiality work together in the context of racialized sexuality, why the art, activism, academia braid for Amber really comes down to the politics of embodiment, how to navigate credit, voice, and schedules when co-authoring with another writer, and why valuing and highlighting embodied knowledge is key to how Amber imagines otherwise. Thank you so much for being with us today, Amber.
Thank you for having me. This is really fun.
So you're the author of 2 recent books, both of which have made a big splash, I'm excited to say, but both of those books offer very robust feminist and queer theorizations of racialized sexuality. Sensational Flesh, which is about masochism, and Sensual Excess, about what you call queer brown jouissance. What do you find particularly compelling about rethinking the ways that race, sex, and power intersect in historical as well as our contemporary world?
Thinking about race, sex, and power together are really important because they're really the ways that society has been organized, at least longer than the long 20th century, but at least since then. And so I think that it feels really powerful to give different narratives that sort of centralize racialized sexuality and really sort of see the ways that they are working together to kind of produce situations or sort of, structures of power that people find themselves embedded in. And then I think at the same time offer ways to think about different modes of existing sort of either parallel to these structures or kind of outside them, at least temporarily. But it really just feels exciting to me because it feels as though this is really the central node through which people understand themselves and society. So it feels like it's getting to the crux of a lot of issues.
You write a lot about embodiment and fleshiness and the ways that racialized sexuality is lived in really intense ways at the level of corporeality. But you also write a lot about abstraction and aesthetics, and often these in a variety of fields get pitted against one another, right? You have the kind of deep materiality of the body versus the abstraction of aesthetics or art or philosophy or theory or what have you. Why bring those things together? How does maybe abstraction or aesthetics help us think through some of the complexity of flesh?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think, one thing I should say is that sort of at the heart of sexuality or of my thinking about sexuality really is this idea of flesh and fleshiness. And for me, that's sort of, flesh is the site through which knowledge is taken in and produced, and then sort of how it becomes kind of like externalized and how we organize ourselves. So thinking through this knot of modern racialized sexuality really means thinking about like the particular ways that the flesh has been organized. And so one of the reasons that I'm moving towards aesthetics also is to sort of give another access into thinking about sort of like how we can think about flesh. Because for me, sexuality is one arena, but aesthetics is also another way that people have made sense of, have produced knowledge from the body and sort of like left traces of their body through these different organizational systems. And it's sort of, in a lot of ways, I don't want to say like more fun than thinking with science because my background's in history of science, but it offers a way to think about how we might imagine knowledge being organized in ways that people don't expect. So I think it kind of gives like this sort of subtle insight into how society is working or how people want things to work. And because of that, it also offers this repository for like what hasn't been made as legible as, say, like a scientific discourse on sexuality or something like that, right? So it's that duality. It is a site of knowledge, but it kind of requires different types of, I don't want to necessarily say decoding because I don't think that's necessarily the point. But for me, it's very imbricated in kind of this larger product of understanding, how people are enmeshed in society.
Do you have a favorite case study or example from either of those books where you really got to dig into some of the details of this?
I mean, I would say that a lot of that kind of analytic work comes out most in Sensual Excess, where it's sort of about the sort of oscillation between this is engaged with the system of power, and also sort of offering something new. And I would say in a lot of ways, it's not my favorite case because I like them all. I don't write about things I don't like. But Mickalene Thomas's The Origin of the Universe stands out to me as like a particularly legible example of this. So the painting is, in some ways, you can read it as a self-portrait, but it's also kind of a redoing of Gustave Courbet's Origin of the World, which is sort of like the torso of a woman's splayed legs. And there's been a lot of mystery about who this woman is. So Mickalene Thomas, she redid that, but she used herself. So she took a picture of her in that pose and then projected it, painted it in sort of vibrant colors, and put on a lot of rhinestones. So for me, thinking about her explicit engagement with not only that painting, but sort of the genre that it represents, which is kind of between the world of the sexological and the pornographic, in that it's assumed that we will know more about what sexuality is by looking at this woman's vulva, right? Like that's sort of like the point of Courbet's painting. And it's interesting because, Thomas doesn't obscure anything per se, but her mode of producing her own iteration with these rhinestones, by putting her own body in, she has these sort of different references within her work to the work of Audre Lorde and other Black feminists. And she talks often about and uses her mother as muse. So there are all of these other layers that manifest themselves aesthetically, right? So you can read the rhinestones as this sort of invocation of shine, as producing a certain type of tactility to the painting, even though obviously you're not supposed to touch the paintings, but it still feels like very haptically engaged and also very 70s, right? Which sort of goes to thinking about her mother and towards thinking about Audre Lorde and other projects of Black feminism. And all of those, because they're manifest through the aesthetic, right? You can do the work of decoding what else could be at stake, right? So it's sort of a rejection, it's a taking on of the Courbet, but it's also a rejection of that and the production of this other kind of fleshy mode of being.
The way that you're approaching these artworks and these cultural texts that you're looking at is such a really great example of how attention to aesthetics or the artistic or creative element of a text can be brought together really fruitfully with attention to power or kind of interest in social change, as well as that kind of deep analytical or academic interest. So I'd love to turn now to maybe how you find these three different realms, art, activism, and academia, spread across your various projects. What excites you about bringing those three realms together?
So for me, it goes back to embodiment. So I mentioned that my background is in history of science. And I think a lot of what I'm trying to do in these projects is really make a case for thinking about both the political valence of the aesthetic and also that, an argument that knowledge is residing in the production of these works, right? So it is art, but it is also entangled in all of the other things that we traditionally look to see how worlds are organized, how politics are made, how power is transferred, how hierarchies are established. It is my firm belief that sort of if we train ourselves to understand aesthetics in this way, we can begin to sort of shift valuations that have happened and in turn kind of produce a different world, right? And as the name of the podcast is, right, like imagine otherwise, and to really think about, knowledge being embedded in these different sources, reprioritize what it is to relate to others, and really sort of shift our orientation toward the world, right? So for me, in that way, I really do see this production of knowledge as itself like a really important part of social justice, right? Because it kind of builds from this set of orientations and kind of works outward.
So in addition to this solo authored research that you produce, you also co-author several pieces with Maureen Kathmagan. And I know you cover several contemporary art exhibitions and shows for the Brooklyn Rail. I'm curious about that process of co-authoring, because this is something that a lot of Ideas on Fire clients have questions about, certainly something that I've dealt with in various ways or struggled with in various ways. What have you found either particularly challenging or rewarding, maybe, or maybe a combination thereof, I don't know, about writing with somebody?
Yeah, I mean, co-writing, it's sort of, in a lot of ways, it feels like a thing that happened to me rather than a thing I was necessarily seeking out, which is that Maureen is an artist that I write about in Sensual Excess, and we're also friends. So a lot of when my solo work was emerging from conversations that I was having with her. I'd write something and then I'd be like, okay, like, here's what I'm thinking about. And she'd be like, oh, this is great, but you need to push it. And then we decided to make that relationship, I guess, a bit more formalized and actually write together. And it's an interesting process because when I write myself, I obviously have control over everything that is happening and the kind of argument that I'm going to make. And I sort of, map it out ahead of time and think like, okay, I know this is where I want to end up. And the process of co-writing, a lot of it is letting go. And a lot of it is really being open to the surprise of what this other person is going to bring to the table. So the way that we co-write, because we're also coming from different backgrounds. So one, I'm an academic, so I have a lot more time to write than she does. And I also have a lot more practice. Basically, we go to things, we have conversations about it. We each have our kind of different perspectives. And then I'll write out a first draft that integrates both of our ideas. And then she'll come over and sort of go over everything and shift words, push different arguments. And it's really been interesting to sort of figure out like how much structure she needs in order to feel the freedom to make her own argument. And then also how much letting go I can have over, I'll be like, well, I put this in because I think this is important. And she'll be like, well, you didn't really make a case for it in the writing, so I cut that. So it feels very much like the way that I want to see ethics embodied in the world. So it feels important to do, but it is, it's whenever you're negotiating with somebody, it's always tricky. And I think in our case, one of the things that's also complicated is because my general profession is writing, right? It's also a negotiation around credit and making sure that she gets equal credit for the things that we write together and that my name or my technique doesn't overshadow her contribution. But it's wonderful because it's really a lot of learning from each other and being open and being vulnerable. And also sort of, there's a lot of ego swallowing and being like, okay, that is true, that argument that I thought I wanted to make that I thought was so clever actually doesn't fit and maybe doesn't work. And, I have to be open to letting that go. Whereas in my own work, I can sort of be like, all right, I'm just going to massage this. And like, I can be stubborn and keep it in, but it is sort of like they're their own other pieces, which is cool also.
What kind of projects are you working on now?
Well, we actually just finished two pieces for Brooklyn Rail, one on Lorna Simpson's new show, The Darkening, which is up at a gallery in Chelsea, and then another one for Sonia Clark, her exhibit in Philadelphia. It's about the truce flag that was flown to start the process of surrendering at the Civil War. So a lot of the things that I write about on my own are more figural, but with Maureen, we tend to gravitate towards more abstract pieces. In large part because it gives us more space to be able to kind of smuggle in other ideas about, like, here's this ethical framework that we want to think about. And this artwork is sort of like the occasion for thinking about that. And I think ultimately we're hoping to write a book, but it's going to be thinking more seriously about different artists that sort of produce their own versions of the gaze and sort of different forms of ethical relation that follow from that.
So this brings me to my absolute favorite question that I get to ask folks, which really gets at that big why behind all of the work that you do. And that's that version of a better world that you're working towards. When you co-author these pieces, when you do your solo authored research, when you go to exhibitions, when you work with students, what kind of world do you want?
It's such a complicated question, right? Because there's so many different dimensions. There are obviously practical things in the world that I want that I think would not necessarily be surprising. I feel at this point most invested in really cracking open what people consider knowledge and really thinking about ways that that can shift series of valuations. Because I really do firmly think that if we can shift the priorities of, what people consider valuable, right? Like if thinking about this, if we can think about the idea that there is all of this knowledge in our bodies that can be accessed in all of these different ways, that we can sort of learn to value difference in a more ethical way. We can relate to others better. We can hopefully deprioritize the individual, give more space for autonomy, more space for opacity, and just sort of be able to better relate to each other and respect different modes of being. If that could actually happen, that would produce a lot of really concrete changes because it doesn't feel that impossible. Like it feels so doable, but the changes I think ultimately would be massive.
I agree. Well, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing all of the creative ways that you imagine otherwise.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Imagine Otherwise is produced by Ideas on Fire, and this episode was created by Christopher Prasad and myself, Cathy Hannabach. You can check out the show notes for this episode on our website at ideasonfire.net, where you can also read about our fabulous guests, as well as find links to the people and projects we discussed on the show.